So a little bit about myself. So we had a little bit of an intro to myself by Shreyasha, which was fantastic. And again, I'm partnerships manager at MAAMII, which is the Montreal AI Ethics Institute. And here, what I do is I basically take charge of reaching out to external collaborators and external organizations to organize partnerships through there, such as in any meetup event or any basically publication collaborations as well. And then I also write weekly research summaries for our newsletter, which you'll be able to sign up to when you search for the brief at Montreal AI Ethics. And also, as sort of ties in my role a little bit to my philosophy degree. So I'm still a philosophy undergraduate, and I'm basically in my final year. And this has a lot to do with how I became interested in AI as well. So myself, I always wanted to study philosophy. I loved gray areas and I loved applying ethics. That was always my favorite side to philosophy, was to apply the ethics that I was learning about. And then I wanted to study it at university. And then eventually I was having to decide, that I really did want to study philosophy at university. And my mum was always on board with it. But then I went to my South African dad and I said, Dad, I want to study philosophy. And he's like, well, Connor, are you just going to die with your thoughts? And I'm like, that's a very good question. And from there, this is where we both found AI and found that I could do my favorite part of philosophy through basically applying it to AI. And then my background, having been born and raised in South Africa until I was 9, helps me to sort of shape what I'm interested in at the moment. So at the moment, I'm writing about anthropomorphism and AI, but I'm also extremely interested in AI and Ubuntu. And Ubuntu is a Southern African or sub-Saharan basically philosophy, which is all about, it's a communitarian philosophy, which is all about our relationships with others. So it's basically, slogan is I am because we are. So I am because I'm able to be myself through other people. And this, I think, sheds a really interesting light and a very helpful light on the human aspect of artificial intelligence, which I find is sometimes missed within AI because of all the talk about efficiency, about accuracy. I think that we forget that the technology is actually for humans and is designed by humans as well. So a little bit about the Montreal AI Ethics Institute is we're an international nonprofit research institute where we're trying to define humanity's place in an AI-driven world. So we're democratizing AI literacy through building public competence and creating community. So a couple of ways that we do this is that we release our quarterly State of AI Ethics report, and this effectively is all the latest and greatest happenings within the AI space included in basically a 200-page document, which as a student, I know sounds really daunting to read a 200-page document, but when you hop into it, there are all sorts of subsections from privacy to misinformation that you can read every now and again. And they comprise our research summaries that the staff have written at MAAMII, as well as general article summaries as well. So all the latest happenings can be found in these that we release quarterly. And from there, you'll be able to get your AI fix. And then also we have the learning community report, which I had the great pleasure of working with Shreyasha on. And here we basically, after a cohort of 15 over an 8-week period where we discussed all sorts of issues within AI and society, we produced a fantastic report, which is just the epitome of the main importance and the main benefit of working in an interdisciplinary team. We had politicians, we had engineers, we had mathematicians, we had writers, all present in the call. And over this 8-week period, we got some extremely interesting insights and we're able to express this in our learning community report as well. So I would highly recommend checking out those publications as well. So what I'll go through today is what facial recognition technology actually is, what problems does facial recognition technology present, the need for industry ethics as a result, some ways forward, and then I will be concluding. So just getting ready for some. Dun, 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 dun. Here we go. Perfect. So the poll is live. So when you have time and when you're ready, please do type in your answers. So basically you go to slido.com and then you'll be able to put in your answers. So tracking lives, interesting one. Surveillance, face. All right. China, interesting. Object AI, spies everywhere. Yep. Unlocking your phone, excellent. So all different ways of thinking about them, which is why I quite like the word cloud, because you can see everyone's different answers and the different types of thinking. FBI, surveillance and privacy are coming up. Yeah, excellent. Anti-freedom, CNN, Facebook. Facebook's a very interesting one. Awesome. Thank you so much for the answers, everyone. Keep them coming. Keep them coming. Image processing, recognizing. I have a good face. Interesting. Can you actually have a good face? Is there a face that is sort of just objectively very easy to map? Yeah, interesting. Google Photos, tagging. Awesome. Twitter, AR, VR. So a lot of common themes I'm going to touch upon are definitely coming up as well. 40 answers, which is great. Awesome stuff. NSA at the door, blocked by a mask. Yep, very, very inconvenient for facial recognition, which we'll come on to later as well. Surveillance as well. Awesome, Robin. Fantastic. Sports, interesting. Cool. This is seriously cool. So I'll leave that poll for now and I'll head back to my presentation. So it'll stay live so you can carry on contributing, but I'm going to head back to my presentation. But thank you. What is facial recognition technology? So I've seen a lot of the sort of current theme popping up. We've got surveillance, we've got recognizing faces, we've got the FBI, CNN. So what facial recognition sort of is just in itself is effectively what it says on the tin. So it recognizes faces. And the way that it does that can be distinguished in two ways. And effectively, the two ways, what they have in common is the use of a template. So a template, effectively, what is created when a facial recognition technology model analyzes a photo is that a mathematical representation of the face in that photo is created. And then this template can be used in the two different ways. So we have facial identification and facial verification. So facial verification is what we saw in the word cloud, is the use of like unlocking a phone, for example, or if you go to an airport, another way to basically verify that you are who you are. And then this template that's created and that's analyzed to verify who you are is stored locally. So for example, on your phone. So when I'm on my phone, it's got a mathematical representation that my face is my face. And then when I look at it, it unlocks because it is one-to-one matching. So it's just trying to verify that the face in front of it is my face. And it's trying to verify that is this person close enough or basically exact match to the template I have? No, I won't unlock. Okay, so then if it is close enough or it is exact, I'll unlock. This brings up a problem with identical twins, just to see just how accurate these algorithms are. And so that will be facial verification. The other side is facial identification, which is sort of the more complicated side to it as well. So here, this is one-to-many matching. So I'll have a mathematical representation of a face, and I'll be scanning thousands upon millions of photos in order to try and identify the face I'm looking for. So this is very akin to like in Jason Bourne, where this is used in basically a very, very wide application, like in a public space, where you're looking for a basically as similar a match to the face that you've made the template of as possible. So if I'm looking for Jason Bourne, I've scanned his face from all sorts of photos in the database, and I'm scanning throughout lots and lots and lots of faces, either live or photos, to try and identify Jason Bourne. And this was something very similar to what I did in my IBM Coursera course. So here I basically was training an algorithm to recognize photos of chairs. And when it was recognizing photos of chairs, effectively it gave a identification score, similarity score. So if I gave it a photo of a chair after I've trained it up on all sorts of different photos of chairs, it would say, okay, 90% sure that it's a chair, 10% it could be a table, kind of thing. And in this sense, this is what you're doing with facial identification. So you're going through all these thousands upon millions of faces to try and see which is the most similar to the template I've created in our example of Jason Bourne. So I'm just trying to find as similar a match as possible. And then if I find someone who's not a match at all, then I get a very low similarity score. And this brings up a very interesting sort of look at the automated and augmentative uses of AI. So facial verification is most likely to be automated. So there isn't a human involved when you're looking at your phone and then it unlocks. It's automated. The technology recognizes if it's you or not, and then it unlocks or locks accordingly. And augmentative use is basically referring to where an AI helps out a human. And this is more likely to be on the facial recognition sort of identification side. So when I'm looking for Jason Bourne, I'm using the AI to help my search. Rather than me going through the whole town and whole city trying to look for him, I'm getting the AI to help me out. But as a result, facial recognition technology in terms of identification produces the most hazards. So the kind of similarity scores that are looked at, the kind of similarity scores that are experienced, how much trust I put into the results, and the kind of data sets that are used as well, which I'll get onto later, can also prove a bit of a problem when we're talking about identification. So that's sort of in a nutshell what facial recognition technology is. So I'm going to head back to Slido now, and having sort of touched upon what the technology is, I'd just like to know what are some problems that immediately jump to mind? What are some problems that you sort of, having seen what facial recognition technology is, do you think about? So I'm going to stop sharing the screen. I'm going to pop straight back to this side. Awesome. It's a fantastic word cloud, so thank you so much. And I would just like to know, what do you think are some problems that facial recognition technology brings? Anything that springs to mind that immediately jumps out at you? There we go. Ethical or technical, privacy, excellent, a lot of privacy, surveillance. Yep, awesome. Twins, 1984, yep. Advertisements, privacy breach, yeah, a lot about privacy. Misclassifying people as monkeys, unfortunately, yep. Jealousy, racial bias, dystopic, yeah. Deep fakes, interesting, yeah. Mental health, yep, I'll come on to that later on. Edward Snowden, profiling, somebody recognizes humans as a donkey, yep. War, very interesting. Depression, yep. Security, privacy is a very popular one. Jason Bourne, nice. A locked phone, all right. Do not want a locked phone at all. Abuse, buys data. Stalking, yep. Loki. Imperialism, that's a new one. All right. Excellent. Paranoia, yep. Spider-Man, interesting. US Congress, yeah. The Matrix becomes real. That would be very, very intriguing. Great. So this is also looking great. I'm going to leave this now. And then I'll come back to it once we do a little bit more of our presentation. Awesome. Thank you again for your answers. These are producing some fantastic and seriously interesting insights, and they will be covered as well when I carry on with my presentation. So what I'll do now is I'll go through some problems that I've identified with facial recognition, and it'll go through sort of in the following. So it's need for specificity, its potential for bias, the confidence people place in the results, basically where it becomes a taboo to question what the technology is basically outputting as an answer, how it's difficult to opt out of the technology, and then a little bit of philosophy because I couldn't resist, and basically how it affects our social behavior. So facial recognition technology needs specifics. Effectively, what this is all about is that the technology is only as good as the training data. What you put in to facial recognition technology, you get out. So in this sense, it very much needs very high quality data in terms of photos. So it needs good lighting, it needs a very, very unnoisy background, and it also needs to have a clear image in order to properly and fully appreciate and train on the data and the photo provided. So in this sense, it needs to have this very specific and very niche kind of photo that's provided. And unfortunately, sorry society, this is not how society is. So society, when you're using it for mass surveillance, that has come up in our sort of word cloud, is that you're not able effectively to have these kinds of photos. Society isn't always in fantastic lighting. It isn't always in a non-noisy background. It isn't always a crisp photo in that sense as well. So in the sense, applying such a technology that needs this kind of specifics to a society that cannot really provide it is very problematic. And also people change. You know, if you scanned a photo of me when I was 13, I look completely different now when I'm 22. And babies as well change even more quickly than that. People get plastic surgery, they change their hair, some people change eye color, some people have unfortunate accidents. So you have to constantly update the database that the technology is using. And as a result, this kind of privacy, this kind of data bias, these kinds of problems then come in as well. And this helps to bring up a very common AI theme, which is sort of narrow versus wide AI. So narrow AI is where your AI application needs to have a specific setting with specific rules for a specific task. So it's very narrow in the sense that it does this under these circumstances in this time kind of thing. So a good example is in 2016, where AlphaGo, playing the traditional game of Go, beat the human champion Lee Sedol, producing all sorts of new techniques and new moves that no human had ever sort of seen before. And while this is an AI triumph, in one way, it also needs to be taken into consideration that it's a very narrow application. So it doesn't mean that now AI is going to be better than humans, going to take over the world or anything like that. It specifically means that in this very specific context of playing Go, this AI is very much more advanced than the human user in this sense, because Go has a set number of moves that can be made. It has rules that need to be followed, and there's no sort of any external challenges that will come in and disrupt what the AI is doing. So in this sense, the AlphaGo algorithm is very, very narrow, as opposed to a wide algorithm. So a wide algorithm or wide AI application in this sense is that there isn't really this need for specific circumstances or specific rules or anything. It's a wide application. So in this sense, a good way to sort of show the contrast is in the medical field. So a narrow AI would be looking for a specific disease in a specific age group with a specific gender for basically as a result of a specific disease. So for example, a particular eye disease that is caused by type 2 diabetes in males between the age of 30 and 55 in this kind of field in that sense. So that's a very narrow use of the AI. So it's very specific. It's this disease, this amount of this age range for as a result of this disease, that kind of thing. And a wide AI would be to look for any type of cancer for any age group in any part of the body. So that's the difference between narrow and wide AI. And facial recognition technology can be very narrow. It can only at times recognize photos that are very high quality, good lighting, and in a particular place. Whereas despite this, companies and people are using it as if it was a wide application. So this is where that tension basically comes into play. And as we saw in the word cloud, facial recognition technology is very synonymous with bias. So this is where our data set quality comes in. So the data set, in order to make for a very reliable and very representative technology, needs to be diverse, it needs to have high photo quality, and it needs to be quantitative as well. It needs to have the representative amount of photos that's needed in order for the technology to be able to provide an accurate photo, an accurate analysis, I should say. So in this sense, historical and human touch consequences can come in where this kind of quality data set is not provided. So in this sense, using data sets from the past, which may not be representative, which may contain more white male faces or photos of white males than black females, this will then come out in the facial recognition technology. So again, in this sense, what you put into the facial recognition technology, you get out. So it's almost like we're teaching a baby its ABCs. So if the facial recognition technology is a baby and I'm teaching it its ABCs, I want to start with A, B, C, D, and then teach it appropriately. And then as a result, the baby will go about its life saying that, okay, ABCs go like this, A, B, C, D. However, if I then start teaching my baby from the beginning that the first letter of the alphabet is actually Z, then it'll go its whole life thinking that the first letter of the alphabet is Z. So like with facial recognition technology, if I just supply it with data that comprises of photos of just white males, then it's only going to be able to accurately recognize photos with white male faces. And this is something that Joy Walamwini found in her study. So here she found the error rate basically was 0.8% for light-skinned males when she was investigating the facial recognition technology, and up to 34% for darker-skinned women. So this can be as a direct result of the unrepresentative and non-diverse data set that was applied to this facial recognition technology that can be as a result of historical and human touch consequences. And this is something that happened with Google and its facial identification technology, which was seen in the word cloud as well, is that it recognized some Black people as gorillas. So in this sense, there weren't enough photos of basically Black people and gorillas in order for the quality or the technology to be able to identify the difference between the two. And as a result, it confounded the two. So this can be as a result of data set bias. And even despite these results, we've still got some concerns with the level of trust that I see within these technologies. So more and more weight is given to facial recognition technology decisions, and it's almost becoming some sort of a taboo, and like almost the technology knows better, due to technology-based solutions, in the sense, the technology-based solutions mindset. In this way, we're throwing technology at the problem and saying that, okay, because it's proven me wrong once or twice that it's more accurate than me and this and that and the next thing, as a result, I need to trust every decision that it makes. I cannot question it. I must adhere to it because it knows better than I do, which doesn't actually necessarily have to be the case. So in this sense, it may be that the technology is more accurate, but doesn't mean that it's always more accurate. So in this sense, we shouldn't sort of fall into the level of false trust that we trust the technology just because it's been right before, so it'll be right again. We must also be able to critically and feel empowered to think about how the technology is acting. So in this sense, we can trust technology for sure, but it must be warranted. And this is something that happened to me actually with my Google Calendar. So when I was giving this talk earlier on this year, I effectively was giving a talk in Canada. And here I sent in my times before the 14th of March. And actually on the 14th of March, my talk, I think, was on the 18th. the Canadian time moved forward an hour. So all my times that I sent through were screwed, were out of place, but I didn't know. And then once I got the calendar invite from the organizers, I then saw that my timings were an hour out. It was an hour later than what I actually wanted to, the hour that I wanted to talk at. And I was like, that's weird. It's not at 4, but it's at 5. And my Google Calendar is never usually wrong. So what's the issue? And eventually, after some Googling, I found that Toronto had actually moved forward an hour. So then my talk was an hour later. And it was only by seeing that the Google Calendar was, basically had never made a mistake that I then thought that this is a bit weird. Why is it this way? And it's sort of an interesting little anecdote that this kind of thing can happen, that we fall into this kind of trust, this very heavy reliance on technology in this sense. And then we're still not feeling that we're able to question what's going on. So it's an interesting little scenario. And even then, there is still the issue of the difficulty with opting out. So we trust this technology so much that it's almost basically seen as an inconvenience to opt out of technology, to question it, to take longer, to slow the process down. And this is something that's very, very prominent in airports, for example. So just like with website cookies that pop up, and then it's just so much easier to accept all and get rid of that seriously annoying pop-up. It's basically opting into technology is framed as just a lot easier. And this is very interesting in terms of airports. So in the US, there are 27 US airports that make it mandatory at border control for foreign passengers to undergo and basically be subjected to facial recognition technology. And if you opt out, you are seen as an inconvenience. You are seen as slowing down the process, holding up the queue that now you have to be checked by all the humans. And even then, the Government Institute, the Government Accountability Office in the US, in their 2020 report, found that all of these airports lacked the appropriate signage in order to show how a person could opt out. And it's actually mandatory for foreign passengers, but it's a choice for US passengers. And they lack the signage to be able to show them that they could actually opt out. So in this sense, I think with facial recognition technology, especially, it's just framed as something that's so much easier to opt into, so much easier just to say, okay, let's do it and it'll be fine. Whereas there might be some serious considerations that need to be had. And this brings me on to the philosophy a little bit. So I think facial recognition technology affects our social behavior. And I think it can definitely impact how we see ourselves and how we basically act within society. So I want you to imagine you're in the queue for the ATM machine and you're getting close to the front of the queue and you start thinking, okay, what's my PIN? Ooh, is it right? Is that my PIN? Have I got my card? Okay, which way do I put my card in? What are the buttons like? Is this person behind me getting a bit too close? Can people see me or people watching me? Okay, maybe I should, how much money I'm going to draw and will it come up quickly? Is my card going to work? What if it takes my card in? So all of these kinds of considerations that are happening, that you're basically becoming more and more aware of yourself. So as you get to the front of the queue, you're saying, okay, where am I? Where are people in relation to me? How am I going to act? And I think, like we talked about with mass surveillance, this is something that will happen with facial recognition technology. We'll have this insane or this more intense awareness of ourselves as we move through these spaces that are monitored. And this is something that Sartre and his views on disorientation touched upon. So Jean-Paul Sartre is a wartime French philosopher, basically the father of existentialism. And he talked about his keyhole example. So here, imagine you were peeping through at a conversation in another room through a keyhole. So you're not aware of yourself, you're just focused at looking at this conversation through the keyhole. And the conversation is going on between two people, they're talking, and eventually they stop and they look straight at you. And here you become seriously self-aware. You're like, oh, I really shouldn't have been looking at this. You feel ashamed, you feel extremely awkward. And in this sense, I think when this kind of realization happens with facial recognition technology, something similar can happen. So in here, Friesen, Feinberg, and Smith put it as it was as if you were on a stage acting before an impatient audience. So when you're walking through this kind of social situation where the place where you're walking through is monitored by facial recognition technology, it's almost as if you're on a stage. You're acting in front of those who are behind the camera, and you have to act in accordance with their standards, in accordance to what they deem as good social behavior. And you basically start to worry about why they're watching you, how you're acting. Is a knife that you just bought from a cooking shop, is that going to teach you, sort of treat you as a dangerous person? Are you acting weirdly? Are you walking normally? So I think all of these kinds of considerations will come to the fore. And this is also linking back to our previous point that those who opt out of the technology will have less accessibility in that point, will not be able to enter into these spaces if they opt out. So it's a very interesting consideration as to how this kind of surveillance affects how we view ourselves and how we will act as well. So we're going to head back to Slido again, just the last one. And just before I get on to this topic, I want to know what rules or norms would you prescribe to the facial recognition technology industry? So having viewed all the problems that we've seen and what the technology actually is, what kind of rules or norms would you prescribe to the industry to help stop these kinds of problems happening? So I will stop sharing my screen. I'll share my other one, and then we'll get into it. Awesome. So what kind of rules or norms? So this will be an open text poll, so you have a little bit more characters to play with. And I'd just like to know what kind of rules, are there anything that you would like to see present in the space to kind of stop these kind of things happening? Stop developing it in general. Copyright, transparency, permission. Yep. Fantastic. Misuse, consent. Cool. Only use as a last resort. Consent. User permission. Yep. Transparency. Normalization. Yep. Cool. Yep. Consent is proving an extremely popular one. Excellent. Address dataset bias. Strict rules. All right. Right to delete my data. Awareness. Right to delete my data is a very interesting one. Easy to opt out. Don't divide society, don't split it. Yep. Okay, so acknowledge that there is diversity in the world. Yep. No homogenization. Bias, yep. Permission, consent, very popular. Variety of data. Yeah, no privacy. Cool. Excellent. All right, so I will leave that for now. And you're welcome to carry on contributing. Good sample data, domain specific. And then I will return to the normal screen and log in for error. Excellent. Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And now I'll get on to some norms that have sort of been established, but also the need for industry ethics in itself as well. So Amazon's recognition is a very, very interesting example. So that's Amazon's facial identification service, which is actually acquired by some government institutions in the US to sort of identify people of interest. You're able to completely customize your data set. So there's no sort of legislation on how representative it's to be. It can be completely customizable, completely how you want it. And Amazon, as a result, received a letter from the American Civil Liberties Union saying, basically talking about the threat that this kind of technology poses. And as a result, this is in 2020, they called a 1-year moratorium. Excuse me. And this year moratorium was basically identified as a surefire way in order to give the space a year's break in order to identify and establish the required industry ethics for all players. This moratorium is now over, and Amazon's recognition is still sort of in the air as to whether it's going to be established in this sense as well. So this kind of industry ethics where they're calling for moratoriums show that there is a need for industry ethics. And the South Wales police example is an extremely interesting one as well, where in 2019 they received another civil liberties case from the group Liberty that wanted to basically deem their facial recognition technology as unlawful. And in 2020, it was deemed as such. So in 2020, their technology had to be retired because it was deemed unlawful by the Court of Appeal in the UK. And this was something similar to IBM as well, where they retracted their own technology, their facial recognition technology, due to it being biased. It was found to be biased, and then they retired it and said, okay, no more. This is a big problem. And then now we've seen Facebook in 2021, where they have taken away their own facial identification technology in this sense, where basically on Facebook they would sort of show which photos you would appear in and which you wouldn't. And then they're due to the problems and due to the legislation there as well. So this kind of problem and this kind of need for industry ethics is very, very prominent. And some examples of the industry ethics that are available or sort of established at this point are, or sort of can be some examples of them, and how these spaces moving towards them can be sort of the following. Is that we sort of, as everyone rightly says, need to make it easier to opt out. So the technology shouldn't be seen as the norm in this sense, in some cases, as we saw in the answers you provided as well, but it should actually be seen as almost as a set reason as to why we're using it. So we're not using technology just for technology's sake, but we should be using it for a particular reason. And in this way, we should make it easier to opt out. It shouldn't be the norm just because, it should be able to be a choice. We should go against racial profiling and population surveillance in this way. We need to stop the breach of privacy, as well as going against any racial profiling as treating one group as homogenous, or as treating this group as inherently dangerous, is not something that we should be doing. And going back to the philosophy side of things as well, is that our privacy is very much a way that we distinguish ourselves as individuals. So I have my own privacy and personal identity, that I'm different from you. There are some things you cannot know about me, and only I can know about myself. So having the surveillance and wanting to know everything about everyone with all of the data set to come with it, then how are we going to separate ourselves as beings? In this sense, adherence to data privacy regulations will be a stellar way in order to try and combat this, and how we adhere to having a representative data set and how we adhere to respecting people's privacy will be crucial in adhering to basically combating the problems I've highlighted beforehand. There is the problem as well of being too obscure or diffuse when trying to put out these kinds of regulations. So saying that facial recognition technology should be fair or representative, we need to actually know what those kinds of terms mean. So rigorous analysis, what does that look like? How do you perform rigorous analysis? And what is actually a representative data set? Is it representative in the sense that it represents as many, basically the segments of the population that are of different ethnicities within a population, or does it mean it represents everyone in the world? So we need to actually be able to sort of decide what these kinds of terms mean in order to appropriately move forward in combating the problems highlighted beforehand. So some ways forward. Buddhist ethics is very, very interesting. Super interesting perspective, if you haven't explored it already, is that basically for facial recognition technology is to be adhered to so long as it prevents harm. So for example, in India, it has helped to identify lost children and also stolen children as well, in that sense, kidnapped. being able to identify and verify their identity. So it prevents harm in that way, and we don't want it something that promotes harm, that promotes mass surveillance, all according to some arbitrary norms. In this sense, community involvement is a good one as well. So involving the community and being able to opt in, opt out, to condition the type of technology that's being put forward. And Ubuntu ethics can provide a very interesting thought on it, how the communitarian side is that what's best for the community is what is put forward, and how it involves everyone in the community to make that decision as well can be a very interesting way of expressing how we can go about improving this technology. Having appropriate data sets, I think there's a lot more of a general practice that there is meant to be appropriate data sets used. They do need to be representative, and they do need to be basically involved in the considerations before the technology is actually put out. Appropriate data sets need to be used, and having a conversation about it as well. Some of the main reasons why these kinds of considerations can come up and these kinds of good practices can be established is that people talk about it and people care about it as well. And it's very in line with what we do at the Montreal AI Ethics Institute, where we try and build civic competency in this space in order to carry on this conversation, in order to be able to hold different parties accountable, and also hold parties accountable to involving those who the technology will affect as well. So to conclude, facial recognition technology has potential. It can definitely be used for good, but there's a long way to go. Having the appropriate data sets and having the appropriate privacy regulations will need to be implemented in order for this technology to be able to be properly established. In this way, facial recognition technology affects different people in different ways. And as a result, the different kinds of conversations that need to be had will be essential in order to be able to appropriately tackle this kind of technology and these kinds of problems as well. Because these issues are not only behind the scenes, they're very much prominent. We've seen with Facebook, IBM, those being monitored in different countries in order to basically maintain civic order, like in Myanmar, where protesters were being tracked by facial recognition technology. These kinds of issues are very much real, and this is not something that is to be just pushed to one side. So with that, and just before I conclude, I just want to point everyone to an initiative that we're having at the Montreal AI Ethics Institute, where we are putting out almost monthly definitions on our AI Ethics Living Dictionary, which it comprises of a resource of all sorts of different definitions. So my definitions here, I've gotten from that dictionary, and this has been able to be where we're able to offer a definition, a metaphor, and an example, as well as further resources to different terms like supervised learning, unsupervised learning, AI itself, deep learning, all these kinds of terms. So while this dictionary is not to be final, it's definitely not a finished article. That's why it's a living dictionary. It can offer a very interesting perspective and a very interesting start on being able to have very clear the AI basics as well. With that, thank you so much for listening. I hope you've learned a lot of different things. And I look forward to talking further and to listening to any questions that you all may have.
From the audience? Yes, no.
I have posted my query in the chat.
Awesome. I'll tackle that now. So let me give it a read. Capture spatial images, vehicle images.
Could you read the question aloud as well?
Yeah, with pleasure. IT basically mentions how he was previously working as a governmental database startup in Nepal. And while he was working there, he was introduced to the software that captures facial images, vehicle images from live surveillance video from Indian borders. And the possibility of tracking national ID and Aadhaar card, biometric data-based ID card. And as for my information, India and Nepal have an open border, so it does not require a passport to move in or out. So there's a possibility it is used as a result of being an open border for drug trafficking, human trafficking, organ trafficking, and terrorism from South Asia, which basically affects our passport index and international Nepalese image. So from the view of the authoritarian government, is it okay to track the border activity and movement of people to control these illegal activities? So what are my views on this? So very interesting case study. And I didn't know there was that open border. So thank you very much for letting me know. And I think here, this sort of highlights the tension between the kind of technology that's being used and the kind of attitude that we have towards it as well. So as I mentioned, facial recognition technology has a very clear good use. So someone can definitely use this technology for good, like tracking children, lost children in India, as well as basically affecting these kinds of drug trafficking activities. And in this sense, if it's used to try and tackle these kinds of issues, then there are different kinds of considerations that, as opposed to applying it just to the general being of humans, the general being of society in this sense. So I think that in the control of these illegal activities, the kinds of considerations are that, okay, are we to comprise the individual's basically privacy in this sense? And even if we don't have consent, should we be able to still track these kinds of activities? And then you can talk about whether, in this sense, do criminals in these kinds of situations, do we actually have to ask their consent? Or is the scenario that we're proposing, people have to actively opt out of the technology? So it could be that the technology is something where people are assumed to opt in until they take away their consent in that sense. So in this sense, if that's the case, then tracking these kinds of activities without sort of thinking about the privacy side to it will be fine, because people have to opt out and they have the choice to do that. But the criminals in this sense have not, for example. If it is a technology where you have to opt in, then this is more likely to be a more privatized example of facial recognition technology. So for example, in the US, in Illinois, when sort of CVs are being tracked being analyzed by an algorithm in the hiring process, people are able, actually their videos are being analyzed. People are able to opt out of this service. And this is an active choice. They can opt in or opt out. But in this sense, I feel that when you've got this authoritarian government, that it's unlikely that they offer a service where you have to opt in to use it. I find that if at all, the service would be to opt out. So I think in this sense, tracking these kinds of activities would be fine, because these kinds of considerations are sort of, for whatever reason, you have to opt out rather than opt in. So if the criminals haven't done that, then it should be fine. If they haven't, then it'll probably get passed up to higher stages of government where it's the problem of national security in that sense. I hope that helped answer your question.
Any other questions in the hall?
Please don't be shy.
I have a question.
Please
so we
do.
talked a lot about facial recognition technology, right? But can some of these considerations, a lot of debates we talked about, maybe narrow versus wide, issues of privacy, consent, bias, right, expanded to other uses of AI? And what do you think are things that engineers, as they consider building these technologies, right, should think from a philosophical perspective?
Yeah, so it's a good question. And the role of the engineer is extremely important in AI. But what is also extremely important is everyone on the same page working together in an interdisciplinary environment. So I think when you're having these kinds of engineering considerations, that having this in mind, that these are actually issues that you can help combat, it will be very important. So thinking about the privacy side of things and thinking about what is the technology I'm designing actually being used for, and feeling empowered to speak up about that, I think will be key. At times, I think it's hard for people to speak up in industry, that they want to talk against this kind of thing that's happening, and they don't feel that they can make a change. But one of the things that the founder of May, Abhishek Gupta, always says is that you have more power than you think you do. So in this sense, I would say that when you're making these kinds of considerations, you're able to make them in an environment where you can actually make a change. And I think by having these kinds of considerations in mind, you'll be able to appropriately move forward in your work as well. So within engineers, I think whether you're programming machine learning algorithm to basically for, let's say, an autonomous vehicle, you'll be able to take into consideration all these kinds of different perspectives, the kind of privacy that should be allowed in this kind of car. So can the car know when you usually drive and when you usually don't? This kind of thing. So I think when you're having these kind of considerations, you're already contributing to a very active and a very sort of dynamic environment where you're able to appropriately make a difference and build these kinds of considerations into normal practice and into normal daily life for an engineer as well.
So any other questions? I think we have a few more minutes.
So I've got one in the chat. So are there examples of adversarial attacks on facial recognition systems? It's a good question. And I think there most definitely are. I can't recall any example that comes to mind at the moment. But this kind of technology can very much be liable to these kinds of attacks, like with any technology, like with autonomous vehicles as well. So within an engineering practice as well, building a technology that can maybe you can imagine could be susceptible to these kind of attacks will also influence how you conduct your work as well. So I think adversarial attacks is a very interesting point. And hopefully the facial recognition technology in that sense is not so widespread that these kinds of attacks have such a big impact. But I wouldn't be surprised if there have been examples of those in recent times as well. Are there any monitoring bodies for implementing and regularizing AI ethics? So not so it does depend what you mean by like monitoring bodies, because governments technically could be monitoring bodies. But if you're talking about third parties, there are indeed. So the For Humanity Institute is sort of issuing effectively certificates that say effectively to regulate different AI practices within businesses, to say that, okay, this technology has been audited, and then this technology has been vetted to say that it is actually representative, it is actually appropriate. There's also, I did an internship at a company called Fairly AI, which as part of my internship, I looked up laws and regulations in order to appropriately prep a client for the types of law and regulation that would come up if they were to implement an AI application. And in this sense, these types of businesses are aiming to help clients become basically appropriately law-abiding in that sense as well. And then you've also got a lot of initiatives from the European Union that have set out their AI standards and their AI ethics, basically policies, as well as governments like the UK and in China as well with their Beijing principles. So these kinds of things that are there, but I don't think there are established basically monitoring bodies that are third party in this sense, but it's definitely becoming a norm. And I've got another one. So when asked to people in China, they say the security of the citizen is more important, so tracking our movements and censorship in our country is okay. So do we really need to compromise our privacy for secure society? So it's a good question, and this shows the need to take into consideration the different cultures that are present. So facial recognition technology affects different people in different ways. So in China, the priority is the good of the community, and whatever the government does is always in my interest, and they give me this this kind of life that I like, so it's fine. They can monitor my movements. I can't use Facebook. That's fine. So yeah, people in China aren't really allowed to criticize, which is true. But they will also be able to offer their opinion in different ways as well. So I would say that here comprising privacy for a secure society is a very interesting sort of double-edged sword in that sense. You can be more private, but then in that sense, it's a society as secure. But this also assumes that the only way for a secure society is that you come through this kind of monitoring, which isn't necessarily the case. You can achieve a secure society without having to comprise your privacy. It's just that through facial recognition, which could help create a secure society, this kind of privacy is actually comprised. So I would say that thinking about how we can reach a secure society without comprising privacy is a worthy thing to think about, and not just saying that, okay, facial recognition is the thing, so now we have to decide. Cool, so I got another 2. So besides the orthodox ones, what kind of any unorthodox or out-of-box measures be thought of to improve AI ethics, particularly related to facial recognition technology? So it's a very interesting one, and I would say that the difference between like privatized use and industry use is also very interesting. So sort of thinking about how you're going to use the technology and what it's used for is an interesting way. And privatized sense, a particular problem is that, okay, if I'm using all of these customized data sets, what am I actually using it for? So why am I employing this person to use facial recognition technology, and what am I using it for? And the type of people that you're affecting can be a lot more sort of narrow in that sense. And AI ethics also has to consider how these kinds of things can affect so many different people in so many different ways when used in a mass production in that sense as well. So I think one way is considering who's being affected, and then how many people in that sense as well. And then thinking about human rights is very interesting as well. So in the civil liberties case, the person involved who sort of led the charge against the South Wales police effectively felt that the technology infringed on his rights and caused him distress in that sense. So again, thinking about how this affects the human rights aspect of it as well is super interesting, and whether we have a right to opt in or out of this kind of technology is something that AI ethics is to consider as well. Got another one. So doesn't data surveillance and capitalism start when governments start collecting data from the individual? So that is also an interesting question as well. And I think it depends how that data is used in that sense. So collecting data sort of in theory could be fine, that you're just collecting data if you've got the appropriate consent and you just want to use it for like basically vaccination kind of things, and you've asked appropriate consent, if people have been able to opt out, then that's fine. So in that sense, in the UK, people have been providing data when they've provided a negative lateral flow test in order to provide the government in a sort of a more informed view that of the vaccination status and the kind of infection rate that the virus is having. And then I think the sort of data surveillance and capitalism comes into how that data is used. So is it being used to monitor people? Is it being used to influence people in that sense as well? I think that's when it starts. So another one, so Apple's method comes to mind. Don't they claim they use face, shape, or key points to do recognition? Is there any data that demonstrate that this sort of approach has less bias? So in this sense, it's an interesting one where they're using sort of the face shape and key points as a different way of mapping out the mathematical template of the face, which is supposedly less biased because it doesn't need to draw on certain features that could confuse the facial recognition technology in this sense. So instead of drawing on such as skin color and the kind of lighting that's involved in this kind of thing, it takes key points of a face. So like effectively the type of eyes, the complexion, the face shape in that sense, which is better able to be analyzed and better able to be sort of appropriately configured when it's scanning faces. So this kind of approach could, in theory, be less biased because it doesn't have as many basically features to scan and features to get confused on, and it'll be a lot more specific in that sense. But I'm not sure that it's like guaranteed at this point. I think it's still a little bit up in the air as well. But yeah, I hope I answered those questions. Any more, maybe from the audience or?
Anybody in the hall?
Hello.
Hey.
So a couple of months ago, I read this article, that Apple will scan all of your photos to look for any kind of child pornography. And it was really criticized. And I don't know if they ever took that plan out. So what do you think of that?
Mhm.
Whenever
Yeah, it's,
trying to upload to cloud, scanning their data, for different kind of things. So what's your opinion?
yeah, it's a good question, and I think that one is another way, sort of the privacy between security kind of thing. So you can imagine that when Apple were thinking about this kind of service, they were like, okay, what is the way to catch basically pedophiles who are not out like very externally doing pedophilic activity. So they've just got child pornography, which is illegal. And in that sense, how can we solve that? Well, we can basically include in our terms and conditions that when people upload their photos to the cloud, it may be subjected to this kind of analysis. And it was very criticized, I presume, I still need to read the article, that they didn't provide this kind of information that they were doing this. So then people found that their kind of information was being analyzed without their consent. And in this way, very philosophical issue as well is that the privacy, how far your privacy extends in that sense as well. So are your photos technically private when you upload them to the cloud? Potentially not. So in this sense, how far that goes is another way. Is like, can you actually say that, no, actually, that's my private information that I've actually just uploaded to a public cloud. So can you not look at it? Is a very interesting way to think about it. Now, I would say that first of all, you should not possess any child pornography. So people who are complaining shouldn't have any of that kind of information in the first place. But then in that sense, you have to consider whether you actually shouldn't really upload your information to the cloud if you don't want it to potentially be subjected to any form of analysis in that sense. So how far your privacy extends is probably where I would go on this topic.
And if add to that debate, right, there's also a human rights principle. When you talk about security versus privacy, like most of our laws are based on innocent until presumed guilty. And once you start scanning everything, that's almost the flip where we are scanning everything. And so there's a human rights effect of like security versus privacy versus, security of the whole society, but also individuals' right to being presumed innocence. Do you want to add anything to that, Connor?
No, I think it's very, very appropriate. The audio did cut in and out a little bit, but what I got from what you were saying is that it is so the innocent until proven guilty, based on the privacy and based on the individual in that sense as well. So it's like having physical human rights, so human rights in this kind of physical realm. It's very interesting to see if those carry about to the digital realm in that sense as well, to what is a completely different and ethereal kind of realm where these kinds of things don't seem to have those kinds of actual stellar implications in that sense as well. People seem to be able to misbehave a little bit more than in the physical realm as well. So I think having those kinds of rights discussions is a very interesting way to put it as well.
I have one more.
Awesome.
So I'm not sure if it's a technical question or an ethical one, but regarding the proposition we had about Apple scanning for child pornography, can we not have something that only attributes the data to the person if it triggers the red flag? Like it would only result in loss of privacy to the culprits and everyone else would remain anonymous. Wouldn't that be, I mean, am I missing some technological barriers that I'm not seeing here? I mean, it seems like an obvious solution.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and in that sense, you're sort of having it is a bit of an ethical consideration in that sense, because now you're saying that criminals' privacy matters less than other people's privacy. In the sense of criminals having that kind of privacy are not to have the same kind of privacy as individuals, which seems intuitive, but then enters into all kinds of considerations. Is that this criminal may not actually be a criminal in the sense that they might have this kind of data through being placed there by whatever reason, and being framed in that sense. So again, innocent until proven guilty. And weighing up people's privacy as different goes against that sort of universal human rights approach as well. It's like the 13th Amendment in the US, where criminals who are placed in prison aren't allowed to vote. So that right just gets taken away. So in that sense, having that kind of considerations in this kind of environment where it's just decided that if someone possesses it, then they're immediately guilty, I think can lead to a sort of interesting kind of dynamic in that sense as well. So it seems intuitive, but I don't think it'll be as straightforward as we would like it to be. I hope that answers the question. Okay, awesome.
Any more from the back?
Back of the room.
It's getting a little dark, so it's harder to see. I think we're good. Anybody online?
So I think of one more. So I've got data collected by a technological company is more than governments collect. So as a new power to control the citizen is more by the technological company CEOs and executive than elected leaders that directly violates our democratic views. So what are your views on this? I think this can be very interesting put in the American context, where a lot of companies are seen as too big to fail, too big to legislate against, like Facebook, basically Silicon Valley, where there is maybe an opinion that these kinds of companies are maybe too big and have these kinds of potential to harm democracy and society, as you saw with Cambridge Analytica, and you've seen with facial recognition technology being put out, that this kind of issue could be a serious problem when these kinds of CEOs are able to collect data without the appropriate checks and without any of the appropriate ethics in that sense as well. So I think in this sense, I would advocate for basically the emphasis on the word democratic, is that these kinds of conversations between the government leaders and the technology companies need to happen, because they can definitely feed in to each other. The kind of data that's collected by private companies can help in terms of how the governments can appropriately and basically informedly enact their policies as well. So I'd say that this kind of threat can definitely be neutralized by being sort of shared out between the government and the company as well. And basically by putting in these kinds of legislations and regulations that we've talked about, this kind of dynamic can then be in place, if that makes sense.
I think that's all. Thank you so much, Connor. Is there a way to reach you or Montreal AI Ethics Institute if our participants have more questions?
Yeah, with pleasure. So again, thank you everyone for coming. I know it's the morning for me, but I know it's the afternoon for you, and it's been a very long day. So thank you so much for everyone for coming and for being online as well. So you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. So I don't know if it'd be useful like putting it in the chat, but what I can do is I can share my screen, and then effectively I can show you my Twitter and my LinkedIn. So my LinkedIn and Twitter can be found here. Please do feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn and connect. Otherwise, my email, you can find me on the Montreal AI Ethics website as well. And please do subscribe to our newsletter, which is the AI Ethics Brief. And this, you'll get a weekly newsletter from us with all the latest and greatest developments in the AI space, which is a great way just to keep you honest, just to keep you reading all different types, from engineering sides to political takes to philosophical takes as well. But me personally, just reach out to me on LinkedIn, or you can find me on the Montreal AI Ethics Institute website as well.
Thank you so much. Let's thank Connor once again.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We hope to see you in person and welcome you to Nepal. Hopefully next time.
Hopefully next time. No, that'd be fantastic. Awesome. Thank you so much. No, my pleasure, my pleasure. No worries. Awesome. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good rest of the day.